The snow fell in silent curtains across the Ardennes forest, each flake a whisper of the catastrophe about to unfold. Private First Class William Thompson of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool coat tighter as he peered through the frost-covered window of his foxhole, unaware that he was staring into the face of Hitler's last desperate gamble. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, 1944, the German war machine unleashed its fury upon the unsuspecting American forces stretched thin along the Belgian-Luxembourg border. Operation Watch on the Rhine, as the Germans called it, would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle fought by American forces in World War II. General Dwight Eisenhower had positioned his troops along what military planners considered a quiet sector. The dense Ardennes forest, with its winding roads and steep ravines, seemed an unlikely avenue for a major German offensive. Intelligence reports suggested the Wehrmacht was finished, reduced to desperate defensive actions as Allied forces pressed toward the Rhine. How catastrophically wrong they were. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks began their assault along an 85-mile front. The roar of artillery shattered the winter stillness as German guns unleashed their fury upon American positions. Private Thompson's world exploded in a shower of earth and steel as shells rained down on his unit's positions near the village of Sankt Vith. The German plan, conceived by Adolf Hitler himself, was audaciously simple, yet nearly impossible to execute. 3 armies: the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army led by Erich Brandenberger would punch through Allied lines and race to the port city of Antwerp. By recapturing this vital supply hub, Hitler believed he could split the British and American forces, forcing them into a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate on the Eastern Front, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis in Band of Brothers. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units, many composed of green replacements or battle-weary veterans resting in what they believed was a safe sector, found themselves overwhelmed by the ferocity of the attack. Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment watched in horror as his communications lines went dead one by one. German paratroopers dropped behind American lines under cover of darkness. It severed vital telephone cables and established roadblocks. English-speaking German commandos, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, infiltrated American positions wearing captured uniforms and driving stolen jeeps, spreading confusion and paranoia throughout the ranks. The fog of war descended like a physical presence over the Ardennes. Unit commanders lost contact with their superiors. Isolated pockets of American soldiers found themselves surrounded, and the carefully planned defensive positions that had seemed so solid just hours before began to crumble under the relentless German advance in the town of Clairvaux, Luxembourg. The 28th Infantry Division's 110th Regiment fought desperately to hold their positions. The ancient castle that dominated the town became a symbol of American resistance as soldiers barricaded themselves inside its medieval walls, firing at advancing German tanks with whatever weapons they could find. The die was cast. In the forests and fields of the Ardennes, American and German soldiers would write one of the most dramatic chapters in military history. A story of courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between victory and defeat that would determine the fate of Western Europe. The German juggernaut rolled forward like an unstoppable tide of steel and fury. By dawn of December 17th, Camp Frupp Piper, spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper's 1st SS Panzer Regiment, had penetrated 20 miles into American lines, leaving a trail of destruction that would forever scar the collective memory of the war. Major General Troy Middleton, commanding the 8th Corps, watched his carefully constructed defensive line disintegrate before his eyes. Radio reports flooded in from across his sector, entire battalions cut off communications, severed, and German armor advancing faster than anyone had thought possible. The situation reports painted a picture of unmitigated disaster. The 106th Infantry Division was being systematically destroyed, and the 28th Infantry Division was fighting for its very survival at Malmedy. Belgium, the war took on a particularly sinister character. Kampfert Piper encountered a convoy of American vehicles belonging to the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After forcing the Americans to surrender, SS troops herded approximately 120 prisoners into a field adjacent to the main road. What happened next would become one of the war's most notorious atrocities, without warning or provocation. The German guards opened fire on the unarmed prisoners. Machine guns chattered their deadly song as American soldiers fell in the snow, their blood staining the pristine white ground crimson. Those who survived the initial volley by playing dead watched in horror as SS men walked among the bodies, delivering coup de grace shots to any who showed signs of life. 84 American soldiers died in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Private First Class Charles Apman, one of the few survivors, would later testify that he lay motionless for 3 hours, listening to the moans of his dying comrades while German boots walked past his head. The massacre sent shockwaves through Allied command and steeled American resolve to deny the Germans any quarter in the brutal fighting that lay ahead. Meanwhile, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. German forces had achieved their primary objective of crossing the Our River and were now racing toward the Meuse River crossings. The vital road junction of Sankt Vith found itself directly in the path of the 5th Panzer Army's advance. While to the north, 6th Panzer Army pushed toward the equally crucial crossroads town of Bastogne, General Omar Bradley commanding. The 12th Army Group initially dismissed reports of the German offensive as a limited spoiling attack. A little German patrol action, he told his staff, fatally underestimating the scope and intensity of Hitler's gamble. It would take precious hours for Allied commanders to grasp the true magnitude of the crisis unfolding in the Ardennes. The German advance created chaos behind American lines. Refugee columns clogged the roads as Belgian civilians fled the fighting, their possessions loaded onto carts and wagons in scenes reminiscent of the war's earliest days. American supply convoys found themselves trapped between advancing German spearheads and retreating friendly forces, creating a logistical nightmare that threatened to compound the tactical disaster at his headquarters in Versailles. General Eisenhower received the first comprehensive briefings on the German offensive. The supreme Allied commander, known for his calm demeanor under pressure, recognized immediately that this was no limited attack, but rather a full-scale offensive that threatened to undo months of hard-won Allied gains. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, declared, displaying the steady leadership that had carried the Allies through their darkest hours. Emergency meetings convened throughout the Allied chain of command as senior officers struggled to comprehend how German forces had achieved such complete surprise. Intelligence failures would later be cited as contributing factors, but in the immediate crisis, such analysis was a luxury the Allies could not afford. The immediate priority was containing the German breakthrough before it reached the Meuse River and threatened Antwerp itself. The stage was set for one of the most desperate defensive battles in American military history, fought in the frozen forests of Belgium during the coldest winter in decades. As German pincers closed around the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his 101st Airborne Division found themselves at the epicenter of what would become the most celebrated defensive action of the European war. The paratroopers, originally intended as the Allied strategic reserve, had been rushed forward in a desperate attempt to plug the gaps torn in American lines by the German offensive. Bastogne's importance lay not in its size, barely 3,000 civilians called the Belgian town home, but in its position at the convergence of 7 major roads. Control of these highways would determine whether German armor could maintain the rapid pace of advance necessary for Operation Watch on the Rhine to succeed. Hitler himself had identified Bastogne as a crucial objective, ordering his commanders to take the town at all costs. The 101st Airborne, veterans of the DA landings and Operation Market Garden, arrived in Bastogne on December 19th without their heavy equipment, which remained scattered across airfields in England and France, armed primarily with small arms, bazookas, and determination. They would face the full might of German panzer divisions equipped with the latest Tiger and Panther tanks. General McAuliffe established his command post in the Heinz Barracks, a Belgian military installation on the town's outskirts. His intelligence officers brought increasingly grim reports. The 2nd Panzer Division was approaching from the north, the Panzer Lehr Division from the south, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division from the east. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded, its defenders cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The civilian population of Bastogne found themselves trapped in the middle of a military maelstrom. Families huddled in basements, in cellars as artillery shells crashed through rooftops and machine gun fire echoed through the streets. Local Dr. Pierre Henroul transformed his clinic into a makeshift field hospital, treating both American and German wounded with equal dedication while supplies dwindled and medical equipment ran short, as detailed in Historian John McManus's authoritative account Alamo in the Ardennes. The siege of Bastogne became a microcosm of the entire Battle of the Bulge, pitting American tactical flexibility and individual initiative against German operational excellence and superior firepower. German artillery pounded the town mercilessly, targeting not only military positions, but also civilian areas where snipers might be concealed. The distinctive whistle of incoming shells became the soundtrack of daily life in besieged Bastogne, punctuated by the crack of rifle fire and the rumble of tank engines prowling the perimeter. Food became critically scarce as the siege entered its 4th day. American soldiers shared their rations with Belgian families, while local residents contributed whatever provisions they could spare to the common defense. Water supplies were disrupted by artillery fire, forcing defenders to melt snow and collect rainwater in whatever containers they could find. Medical supplies presented an even more critical shortage. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers in the basement of the local church, their groans mingling with prayers offered by the parish priest. Army medics performed surgery by candlelight, using improvised instruments and precious morphine doses that were running dangerously low. On December 22nd, German emissaries approached American lines under a flag of truce. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment received the German delegation and their ultimatum demanding surrender. The message, written in precise military language, warned that continued resistance would result in the annihilation of Baston's defenders, and promised honorable treatment for prisoners of war. When Harper brought the ultimatum to General McAuliffe, the airborne commander's response entered military legend. Without hesitation or dramatic flourish, McAuliffe replied simply, "Nuts." His aide, Colonel Harry Kennard, suggested that the Germans might not understand American slang, and recommended a more formal response. McAuliffe considered this briefly. Before deciding that his original reply perfectly captured his sentiments, the German emissaries departed with McAuliffe's one-word rejection, and both sides prepared for the climactic battle that would determine Bastogne's fate. In the frozen fields surrounding the town, American paratroopers checked their weapons and whispered prayers, knowing that the next German assault might well be their last. The weather, which had been Germany's ally throughout the opening days of the offensive, suddenly shifted with dramatic consequences for both sides. On December 23rd, the thick cloud cover that had grounded Allied aircraft finally broke, revealing clear blue skies and brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered Ardennes into a glittering battlefield. Captain James Parker of the 9th Air Force's 474th Fighter Group was among the first Allied pilots to take advantage of the improved conditions, banking his P-47 Thunderbolt over the German positions surrounding Bastogne. He could see the full extent of enemy deployments. Long columns of tanks and vehicles stretched along the forest roads like dark serpents against the white landscape. The air support came none too soon for Bastogne's beleaguered defenders. German forces had intensified their attacks during the night, probing American positions with increased desperation as Wehrmacht commanders recognized that time was running against their offensive. Each passing hour allowed Allied reinforcements to move closer to the battlefield while German fuel reserves dwindled to critical levels. Staff Sergeant Robert Hendricks of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment manned a machine gun position on Bastogne's northeastern perimeter when the German Christmas Eve assault began. Through his frost-covered field glasses, he watched enemy infantry advance across the snow-covered fields, their white camouflage smocks making them nearly invisible against the winter landscape. Behind them, German tanks churned through the drifts, their tracks throwing up clouds of snow and frozen earth. The battle for Bastogne reached its crescendo as German commanders threw everything they had against the American positions. Panzer Grenadiers, supported by Mark IV tanks, struck at multiple points along the perimeter, seeking to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper boom of tank guns and the rapid chatter of machine guns in a symphony of violence that could be heard for miles across the frozen countryside. Private First Class Eugene Rowe, gay medic with Easy Company, of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, crawled through the snow from foxhole to foxhole, tending to wounded soldiers under intense enemy fire. His medical bag contained the last of their morphine supply, forcing him to make agonizing decisions about which wounded men would receive the precious painkiller. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, turning blood into crimson ice crystals and making even minor wounds potentially fatal. Inside Bastogne itself, the civilian population endured their own private hell. Madame Suzanne Bertrand sheltered her 3 children in the basement of their home near the town center while German shells crashed through the upper floors. The family shared their last loaf of bread with 2 wounded American soldiers who had taken refuge in their cellar, understanding instinctively that their fates were now intertwined with those of their defenders. Christmas Eve brought no respite. From the fighting, German artillery increased its tempo as Wehrmacht commanders sought to break American morale through relentless bombardment. The historic Church of St. Peter, which had stood in Bastogne's central square for over 5 centuries, received a direct hit that brought down its ancient bell tower in a cascade of stone and timber. Yet somehow, American morale held firm. Chaplain John Maloney of the 502nd Parachute Infantry conducted Christmas Eve services in a bombed-out schoolhouse, his congregation of paratroopers joining their voices in traditional carols, while the sound of artillery provided a grim counterpoint to their songs of peace and hope. The tide began to turn on Christmas morning when elements of General George Patton's Third Army finally broke through German lines south of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion led the spearhead that punched through enemy positions, his Sherman tanks churning through the snow toward the besieged town. Radio operators in Bastogne picked up the first transmissions from the relief force at 10:50 in the morning, electrifying the defenders with news that help was finally at hand. Captain William Dwight of the 326th Engineer Battalion watched from his foxhole as the first American tanks appeared on the southern horizon, their olive-drab silhouettes standing out against the white landscape. The siege of Bastogne was broken, but the Battle of the Bulge was far from over. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Operation Watch on the Rhine. Though German forces would continue fighting with characteristic tenacity for another 3 weeks, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams's tanks had punched a narrow corridor through German lines. But the enemy still controlled most of the roads leading to the battered town, making resupply a dangerous and often deadly undertaking. General George Patton's Third Army had executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history. Pivoting 90 degrees northward and advancing over 100 miles, through winter conditions that would have stopped most armies in their tracks, the logistics alone were staggering, moving nearly 250,000 men with their vehicles, artillery, and supplies across icy roads, while maintaining combat effectiveness, required the kind of operational flexibility that it had become the hallmark of American forces. At his headquarters in Luxembourg City, Patton studied the situation maps with growing satisfaction. Staff officers, many of whom had initially doubted the feasibility of such a rapid redeployment, now watched in amazement as their units continued advancing toward the German salient. "We're not just relieving Bastogne," Patton declared to his assembled commanders. "We're going to cut off every German soldier west of the Our River." The German High Command recognized that their offensive had reached its culminating point. Fuel shortages plagued German units throughout the salient. with many tanks abandoned not due to combat damage but because their crews could not obtain gasoline. American air attacks had systematically destroyed German supply lines, turning every daylight movement into a potentially fatal gamble. Camp Piper, which had advanced farther than any other German unit during the offensive, found itself trapped near the village of L'Église. Colonel Joachim Piper, the aggressive SS officer whose forces had perpetrated the Malmedy massacre, now faced a desperate situation as American forces closed in from 3 directions. His remaining tanks were down to their last few gallons of fuel, and his men were running low on ammunition and food. Technical Sergeant Vernon McGarity of the 323rd Infantry Regiment led his squad through the frozen forests near L'Église, hunting German stragglers and preventing their escape. The tables had turned dramatically from the opening days of the offensive. Now it was American forces on the attack, while Germans found themselves isolated and surrounded in unfamiliar terrain. The weather continued to favor Allied operations. As clear skies allowed unrestricted air support, fighter bombers roamed over German positions at will, attacking anything that moved during daylight hours. Captain Robert Johnson of the 5th Fighter Command described the scene as a turkey shoot, with German vehicles burning along every road leading back toward the Rhine River, as referenced in historian Charles MacDonald's definitive work at Time. For trumpets, the final week of 1944 witnessed a complete reversal of fortune in the Ardennes. German units that had advanced with such confidence and elan now retreated in disorder, leaving behind much of their heavy equipment and many of their wounded comrades. Colonel Hurley Fuller, whose 110th Infantry Regiment had been nearly destroyed in the opening hours of the German offensive, now found himself commanding a rebuilt unit advancing toward the German border. His men, reinforced with replacements and re-equipped with new weapons, displayed a grim determination to exact revenge for their earlier losses. The civilian population of the Ardennes began emerging from their shelters as German forces withdrew. In village after village, Belgian and Luxembourgish families greeted their American liberators with tears of joy and relief. Many had endured 2 separate occupations during the course of the battle, first by advancing German forces, then by retreating Wehrmacht units who often looted civilian properties before departing. By December 31st, the German salient had been reduced to a narrow bulge centered on the town of Huffelise. Wehrmacht commanders pleaded with Hitler for permission to withdraw their remaining forces behind the Siegfried Line, but the Führer remained adamant that his troops continue attacking. This decision would cost Germany many of its best remaining divisions and thousands of irreplaceable experienced soldiers. Captain Charles MacDonald of the 23rd Infantry Regiment spent New Year's Eve in a foxhole overlooking German positions, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred in just 2 weeks. The same American units that had been caught off guard and nearly routed at the beginning of the offensive were now systematically destroying what remained of German offensive capability in the West. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase, but the cost in human lives would continue mounting as both sides prepared for the climactic battles that would determine the fate of Hitler's last gamble. The new year dawned over a landscape transformed by nearly 3 weeks of continuous warfare. Where pristine snow had once blanketed the Ardennes forests, the ground now bore the scars of modern combat shell craters filled with frozen water, abandoned equipment half buried in drifts, and the grim markers of hasty battlefield graves scattered across the countryside. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, coordinated the final phase of operations designed to eliminate the German salient completely. His plan called for a coordinated assault from both north and south, with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group attacking from the north, while Patton's 3rd Army continued its advance from the south. The objective was to trap remaining German forces in a massive pincer movement that would end their offensive capability once and for all. The weather, which had been such a crucial factor throughout the battle, continued to plague both sides as January brought some of the coldest temperatures recorded in Belgium during the 20th century. Soldiers on both sides struggled with frostbite, trench foot, and the constant misery of fighting in sub-zero conditions that turned rifle bolts sluggish and made simple tasks like loading ammunition magazines almost impossible with numb fingers. Staff Sergeant William Garland of the 84th Infantry Division described the conditions in his diary. "The cold is beyond anything I experienced in basic training. Men are falling out not from enemy fire but from exposure. We've lost more soldiers to frostbite than 2 German bullets in the past week." German resistance remained fierce despite their deteriorating situation. Wehrmacht commanders, recognizing that failure in the Ardennes would likely mean the end of organized resistance in the West, threw their remaining reserves into desperate counterattacks designed to keep the salient from collapsing entirely. The fighting took on a particularly vicious character as both sides understood that the outcome would likely determine the war's conclusion. The town of Hufvudstaden became the focal point for the final German stand. Positioned at the base of the salient, it represented the last major population center under German control. American forces approaching from the south could see the smoke rising from its buildings, while British and Canadian units advancing from the north reported increasing enemy resistance as they closed on the town. Lieutenant Robert Bowen of the 8th Infantry Regiment led his platoon through the outskirts of Hufvudstaden on January 15th, picking their way carefully through streets littered with debris and unexploded ordnance. German snipers hidden in the ruins made every advance costly, while artillery fire from concealed positions continued to exact a toll on the attacking forces. The civilian population of Hufvudstaden had endured nearly a month of occupation, liberation, reoccupation, and now a final battle for their town's control. Father Marcel Gordon, the local parish priest, had remained with his congregation throughout the ordeal, conducting funeral services for both soldiers and civilians while shells crashed around his church. On January 16th, patrols from the 2nd Armored Division advancing from the north finally made contact with elements of the 11th Armored Division pushing up from the south. The link-up occurred at 11:45 in the morning on a snow-covered road 2 miles east of Hufvudstaden, effectively sealing the fate of German forces still trapped within the shrinking pocket. Colonel Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 18th Airborne Corps, coordinated the final reduction of German positions within the salient. His paratroopers, many of whom had fought continuously since December 16th, displayed the kind of professional competence that had become their trademark. Moving methodically from position to position, they eliminated the last pockets of German resistance with a combination of small unit tactics and overwhelming firepower. The end came with surprising suddenness. On January 25th, the last organized German resistance in the salient collapsed as Wehrmacht commanders finally received permission to withdraw their surviving units behind the Siegfried Line. What had begun as Hitler's grand offensive to split the Allied coalition concluded with Germany's strategic reserves destroyed and her western frontier exposed to Allied attack. Private First Class Eugene Jackson of the 106th Infantry Division, whose unit had been virtually annihilated in the opening hours of the German offensive, stood among the replacements who had rebuilt his regiment. Looking out over the battlefield where so many of his comrades had fallen, he reflected on the price of victory and the lessons learned in the frozen forests of Belgium. The guns fell silent across the Ardennes on January 25th, 1945, leaving behind a battlefield that would forever be remembered as the site of America's greatest victory in the European theater. The statistics alone told the story of an epic struggle. Over 800,000 soldiers had participated in the fighting, making it the largest battle in the United States Army history. American casualties totaled approximately 1,000 men, while German losses exceeded 100,000, including many of their most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. General Dwight Eisenhower surveyed the aftermath from his headquarters, now relocated closer to the front lines. The Supreme Allied Commander understood that the Battle of the Bulge had fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Western Europe. Hitler's gamble had not only failed spectacularly, but had also consumed Germany's last strategic reserves, leaving the Reich virtually defenseless against the Allied advance toward the Rhine River. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond military casualties. Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians had paid a terrible price during 6 weeks of combat that devastated their communities. In Bastogne alone, over 400 civilians had been killed or wounded, while thousands more had lost their homes and livelihoods. The reconstruction of the Ardennes region would take years to complete, and would serve as a permanent reminder of the war's impact on innocent populations. Captain Charles Whiting of the 2nd Infantry Division walked through the ruins of Sankt Vith, the town that had been completely destroyed during the fighting. Every building showed damage from artillery fire or aerial bombardment. The streets were littered with the debris of modern warfare. Local residents who had returned to assess the damage moved like ghosts through their former community, searching for any remnants of their previous lives. The strategic implications of Germany's defeat in the Ardennes became apparent almost immediately. With their mobile reserves destroyed and their defensive lines compromised, German forces could no longer mount effective resistance to Allied advances. The road to Berlin lay open, and Hitler's thousand-year Reich was clearly entering its final phase. Intelligence assessments revealed the extent of German desperation that had prompted the offensive. Intercepts of enemy communications showed that Wehrmacht commanders had opposed the operation from its inception, recognizing that it represented an unacceptable risk given Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Hitler's insistence on launching the attack despite these objections demonstrated the degree to which Nazi leadership had lost touch with military reality. The American forces that emerged from the Ardennes fighting bore little resemblance to the troops who had entered the forest. In December, seasoned by combat and hardened by adversity, they displayed a professional competence that impressed even veteran British and Canadian allies. The myth of German military superiority, already cracking after years of defeats on multiple fronts, finally shattered completely in the Belgian snow. Technical Sergeant Harold Frank of the 28th Infantry Division, whose unit had been among the first to face the German assault, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed in American soldiers during the battle. "We went into those woods as boys playing at being soldiers," he wrote to his wife. "We came out as men who had looked death in the face and refused to blink." The Battle of the Bulge also marked a turning point in military technology and tactics. The extensive use of air support, coordinated artillery fires, and mobile armor had demonstrated the evolution of combined arms warfare. American commanders had learned to integrate these capabilities in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. On the battlefield, lessons that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. Perhaps most importantly, the battle had proven American resilience under the most adverse conditions imaginable. Caught completely by surprise, outgunned and outnumbered, American forces had not only survived the initial German onslaught, but had ultimately turned the tables on their attackers. This demonstration of national character under extreme stress became a source of pride that transcended military circles. As spring returned to the Ardennes in 1945, Belgian farmers began the long process of reclaiming their fields from the detritus of war. Unexploded ordnance would make this dangerous work for years to come, but the cycle of seasons offered hope for renewal and recovery. In the village cemeteries, rows of white crosses marked the final resting places of young men who had died far from home in defense of principles larger than themselves. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but its legacy would endure as long as free. Peoples remembered the price of liberty and the courage of those who paid it in full measure during that terrible winter in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The real story of the Ardennes was not just one of military tactics and strategic objectives, but of ordinary individuals who found extraordinary strength when their cause demanded nothing less than everything they had to give.